Theo Pride represents the Detroit People's Platform, which is dedicated to building a Detroit where race and the priorities of majority Black Detroit are centered. Their work advances racial and economic justice in the nation's largest Black majority city by organizing with residents and community leaders to build grassroots power and transform systems and structures that make real the vision for a racially just Detroit. Theo?
Yeah, again, thank you for having me on, giving me opportunity to speak on this matter. I think I want to start by kind of pointing out that there is a difference between theory and the real world. What we've seen presented here was quite theoretical, right, and idealistic. We heard a bunch of positives, only positives that stem from tax incentives. As if there are no consequences, as if there are no negative impacts. And we all know when something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So yeah, in a perfect world, in a very perfect theoretical world, tax incentives attract big business and a bunch of investment and enriches the city through big time economic development. It brings jobs and prosperity and opportunity. It grows the local economy and increases the general fund, and you got more money for schools and libraries and parks, and everybody benefits from this trickle down effect. But that is the theory. And is based on that theory that in places like Detroit that have unique challenges to economic development, you have to incentivize development. People simply just won't come to Detroit. You have to give tax breaks to developers to attract people who wouldn't come, to cover the high cost of site remediation, to make projects financially viable and doable because of all of the financial challenges. And then also too, everybody's doing it. Everybody's giving away incentives, right? You simply cannot be competitive, right, in the development landscape if you don't give these particular tax incentives for development. And the theory goes, once you attract the businesses with the incentives, all the prosperity comes. Once they come, all the benefits come. You activate unused, blighted land, and you activate the land that has been sitting untaxed, and you get to tax it, and you generate a new property tax, and you produce jobs, and you revitalize the area, and so forth. And so new economic activity in the city revenue trickles down to everybody. That becomes the theory that the public institutions, the schools, the libraries, they eventually receive the much needed resources that they need. But now the reality, right? And let me say this too. Yeah, the city, right, and economic development corporations, they aren't handing over a bag of money to developers, but essentially what they are doing is foregoing, right, public monies that would go to the public coffers, right? You can do that through abatements. Abatements simply reduce taxes, and TIFs redirects taxes to essentially finance an aspect of the development. But if you want to look at it in terms of they wouldn't receive the little amount of taxes if it wasn't for the tax incentive, you can look at it on the flip side. They aren't receiving the increased value from the development because of the tax incentive as well. So let's look at the reality. Tax incentives sound good in theory, but they do not work like that in reality. Right now, anybody in the room, Google, do tax incentives work? Research shows overwhelmingly that tax incentives don't help municipalities. They don't help cities. They help developers. They help investors. They make the development, they make the project much, much, much more profitable, right? More often than not, and this is what the research shows. This is not DPP conjuring these things. This is the established research on this, right? More often than not, right? They don't produce the expected jobs that the developers say they will produce. The public loss outweighs the job if they do produce jobs, right? Studies show that developers probably would have created the jobs anyway regardless of the tax incentive, location and demand are more important in terms of development than the incentive, right? They would develop if the incentive wasn't there. There are typically no spillover effects, meaning that when development comes, you don't see the proliferation of this type of public investment leading to massive economic development for the whole city. And typically, you see revenue loss in the long run. I bring up the idea of these trickle-down effects, the idea that these things sound good in theory. Just like trickle-down economics is a theory that we all know, and we all know it is a failed theory. This shouldn't even be debatable. It has failed. It sounds good in theory, right? But in practice, it does not work like that. And tax incentives are essentially the same type of vehicle. The idea, if you simply give rich people and wealthy investors more money in tax breaks, somehow we all benefit. And you have seen how that has worked out in the last 50 years in terms of trickle-down economics. Only benefits you have seen is the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%. Everybody else has lost out. So that's overall the tax incentive thing, right? They don't work in general, but they might work in Detroit, right? So do they work in Detroit? We've been doing this thing for quite a while. Do they work? Let's start with the amount of money that has been invested, right? Since 2010, almost $2 billion have been awarded just in brownfield tips alone. The DDA captures millions of dollars in taxes every year and traps them downtown, right? Dan Gilbert and the Illich Development Association, a group, they've been given hundreds of millions of dollars in abatements and incentives. And millions every year, right, is given in Oprahs and NEZs and CRAs and RZs and IFTEs and elemental Ps and all of that. So does anybody, right, for the city or DEGC or what have you, does anybody really know exactly concretely how much money and tax incentives the city is giving away in total every year over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years? More importantly, does anybody know what benefits these giveaways have produced tangibly? Have we seen a recouping of our money? Are these incentives working, right? What are the concrete numbers? What is the real analysis? Does it even exist? So, what do we know in the real world, right, in Detroit? We don't know in terms of the analysis, in terms of over the course of years, have these tax abatements panned out the way in which they said it has. A lot of it's because of transparency. We just don't have any access to the data. But what we do know is this, in terms of the impacts. Development can occur in Detroit without incentives, because it has happened. Incentivized developments are harming Detroiters. They are harming residents. They are causing harm to Detroiters. They do not pay off in job creation. They do not pay off in adding money to the general fund. And there are other ways of doing development. Let's start with this but-for thing, right? So development can't occur in Detroit unless you incentivize it, unless you provide these breaks. Nobody wants to come to Detroit, so forth and so on. Well, if incentives are driving development, incentives are the thing, right? And if they are all that, these developers would have been here decades ago, wouldn't they? Did the DDA exist in the 70s? Did the industrial facilities tax exemption exist in the 70s? Didn't we have NEZs in the 90s? Didn't we have this stuff before? Why all of a sudden now? Why luxury condos now? Why industrial facilities now? It is because what the research says, incentives don't drive development. The market drives development, right? Demand is different in Detroit than it was in the 70s, and the supply seems to follow, right? Studies show that Detroit is a desirable destination. It has been identified as a climate haven, a water haven, Also, studies show that much of suburban development is saturated. And also Detroit has supply chain advantages. So there are aspects of value to Detroit, right? Why people would come here and develop, right? And then also, like I said, development can and has occurred here without incentives. The Amazon development is an example of such. So let's look at this idea of benefit, right? That Detroiters receive all of this benefit and no harm in the so-called the following impacts. So every year, tax incentives are robbing public institutions of the money that they should have, right? Good Jobs First show about 20 million is captured away from our public school system, about 4 million away from our libraries. Incentives are being used, tax incentives are being used to not just build all kinds of small businesses here and there and this nice little family dwelling over here. No, they're being used to build very specific projects, namely luxury housing. Luxury housing in a city where the median income is $32,000. We can't afford these luxury apartments and this luxury housing, but our tax dollars are being used or foregone to build these type of things in a city where we've had a housing crisis for some time. Studies show about 9% of all of Detroiters are being pushed out of the city every year due to a lack of affordable housing. So why are we spending so much money, time, and energy building things that don't help the average Detroiter, that actually harm Detroiters by pushing them out of their own city, right? A lot of money has been given to industrial development, right? Industrial developments create negative health impacts for Detroiters. This has been proven over and over and over again. The marathon has caused health impacts. Stellantis right now is causing health impacts to its residents, right, in Veneto, right? So the most vulnerable people in the city are not benefiting the way in which it is purported to be. They are actually being hurt, right? Low income, working class, families, single mothers with children, seniors, our children are being hurt by this type of development. It is not about the tool. The tool can be okay. Tax incentives can be okay. It is about what is being built with that tool, and what is being built with that tool is harmful, right? The benefits calculations are political. They're only showing you, and they're only using metrics that fit their agenda. What about the benefits that include, or they factor in the way in which, right, Black residents, low income residents are being displaced out of the city? How people are dealing with health impacts and so forth. These are part of the cost benefit analysis that you will never see because they don't want you to see it. Let's look at this, right? And I know I got to speed it along here, right? Tax incentives create all of these jobs, right? A lot of times it's not worth it. One, right, they seem to be really harmful jobs, poisonous and so forth. But if we look at the job market, and I know it's due to COVID and so forth, but net job growth over the last 3 years is actually negative, right? Why? Because market dictates job growth, not incentives. And the jobs that are being created are concentrated in certain areas, downtown and midtown, where Black Detroiters don't live largely. Most of the job creation is in downtown and midtown. The rest of Detroit has been identified by the research as a job desert. There are no jobs in the rest of the city. So how is majority of Detroit benefiting from job creation? Suburban residents have most of the downtown jobs. Studies show this as well. Unemployment among Detroit residents are amongst the highest in the nation. And also too, the jobs that are being created are creating racial disparities. Income for white workers have increased 7 times higher than for Black workers in the city of Detroit. So our tax dollars are buying, right, Detroiters low wage service jobs, and not a lot of them at that, right, and buying, right, suburbanites, right, and white folks nice, great professional jobs. So how do Detroiters benefit from that? let's look at this idea that it grows the general fund. The general fund has barely grown over the last few years, if at all. In 2017, the general fund was 1.08 billion. This year is estimated to be, guess what? 1.08 billion. That's great growth. That's a great return on our investment. Most of the increases, when we do see increases, is not due to land development activity through incentivized strategies. It has been due to the casino activity, betting. So we barely make anything from property tax because we give it to private developers. Here, you take the land, you give us the jobs in return, and you keep all of the value on the land.
Thank you, Theo. That is your time. Thank you so much. I'd like to take this time to thank all of the panelists for giving their input and information involving this. And now is the point at which we are opening it up to Q&A. I have been monitoring the chat, and my coworker, Mr. Jonathan Scott, has been watching to see whose hands are raised. So we're